The German soldiers of the 18th Army's 126th Infantry Division had grown accustomed to the strangeness of the Eastern Front by the winter of 1941. They had marched through villages that seemed frozen in time, fought in forests that stretched endlessly in every direction, and endured cold that made metal burn to touch. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for what they encountered in the Volkhov region, southeast of Leningrad, in January 1942. The landscape itself seemed alive, hostile, and intent on consuming them. The division had been ordered to establish defensive positions in the forested wetlands between the Volkhov and Tigoda rivers, part of a larger German effort to maintain the siege of Leningrad, while containing Soviet attempts to break the encirclement. The terrain was nightmarish, dense pine and birch forest broken by extensive marshlands that in summer were impassable and in winter were frozen but unstable. The ground was covered with deep snow, beneath which lay layers of peat and vegetation that had been accumulating for thousands of years. The Soviet defenders knew this terrain intimately. The Germans were strangers in a landscape that offered no mercy. On the morning of January 7, 1942, German sentries in forward positions began reporting something impossible. The ground was moving, not trembling from artillery bombardment. They were familiar with that sensation. Not shifting from soldiers walking nearby. The ground itself was rippling, undulating like water, moving in ways that solid earth should not move. Officers initially dismissed these reports as hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and cold. But as more soldiers reported the phenomenon, and as officers went forward to investigate, the impossible became undeniable. The ground was moving. Vast sections of the forest floor, covered in snow and appearing solid, were actually floating on semi-liquid peat and water beneath. The weight of German fortifications, equipment, and the soldiers themselves was causing this surface layer to break apart and shift. Trenches that had been dug the previous day had disappeared, filled with muddy water that welled up from below. Bunkers that had been constructed with logs and earth had tilted at angles or sunk into the ground entirely. Supply dumps had vanished into the mire. Most horrifying, soldiers who had been sleeping in dugouts had awakened to find themselves partially submerged in freezing water that had seeped up through ground that had seemed solid. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a platoon commander in the 422nd Infantry Regiment, recorded in his diary, "The ground betrays us. We dig positions and by morning they have filled with water from below. We place equipment on what appears to be solid ground and it slowly sinks from sight. Men wake screaming as water rises around them in holes they had thought were secure. This is not war as we know it. This is nature declaring itself our enemy." The phenomenon was not entirely mysterious to those who understood the region's geology. The Volkhov area consisted largely of glacial deposits, ancient wetlands, and peat bogs that had formed over millennia. The surface, especially in winter, could appear solid, frozen and covered with snow, while beneath lay layers of partially decomposed organic material saturated with water. This peat could be several meters deep, resting on clay or sand that prevented drainage. When the surface was broken or when weight was applied unevenly, the underlying material could shift, causing the surface to move, break apart, or collapse entirely. The Soviet forces defending this region understood the terrain's peculiarities and had developed tactics to exploit them. Soviet soldiers built their fortifications differently, using techniques adapted to the unstable ground. They constructed positions on the more stable patches of higher ground that experience had taught them to identify. They used logs to create floating platforms that distributed weight and prevented sinking. They avoided digging deep into the ground where possible, knowing that penetrating the surface layer would release the water and mud below. Most critically, Soviet commanders positioned their troops to drive German forces into the most unstable areas, where the ground itself would become an ally in the defense. The German 18th Army, operating far from home in terrain completely unlike anything in their experience, had no institutional knowledge of how to fight in such conditions. Their standard field engineering practices, digging entrenchments, constructing bunkers, establishing supply points, were designed for stable European soil, not for floating bogs disguised as solid ground. German soldiers began to understand they were not just fighting Soviet troops, but fighting the land itself, which seemed to actively resist their presence. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soldiers began refusing to sleep in dugouts, fearing they would drown in the night as water seeped up from below. Equipment handlers became reluctant to stack supplies in any location, knowing that heavy concentrations of material would slowly sink into the ground and become irretrievable. Engineers struggled to construct defensive positions that would remain intact for more than a few days. The ordinary tasks of establishing defensive positions, German soldiers could typically accomplish with practiced efficiency, became nightmarish challenges where success was temporary and failure was literally being swallowed by the earth. The situation worsened as Soviet forces launched their offensive. The Lyubin offensive operation, beginning in January 1942, aimed to break the Leningrad siege by cutting through German positions in the Volkhov sector. Soviet commanders deliberately drove their attacks through areas where the ground was most unstable, knowing that German defenders would struggle not just with Soviet firepower, but with terrain that offered no stable foundation for defense. Soviet infantry, supported by tanks that had been specially modified with wider tracks to distribute weight across the unstable surface, advanced through the frozen marshlands while German defenders found their positions literally disintegrating around them. German soldiers reported situations that seemed impossible. Artillery pieces would be emplaced, fired for a few hours, then be found the next morning tilted at useless angles or partially submerged, having slowly sunk into the ground under their own weight and the recoil from firing. Ammunition dumps would be established, only to have the ground beneath them give way, plunging crates of shells into water and mud where they could not be recovered. Field hospitals set up in locations that appeared stable would find their tent floors becoming increasingly boggy, as body heat from the wounded patients thawed the frozen surface, releasing the water beneath. The Soviet defenders had not just adapted to the terrain, they had weaponized it. Soviet combat engineers, many recruited from local populations who understood the region's peculiarities, had spent weeks before the German arrival preparing the battlefield in ways that exploited the unstable ground. They had identified routes through the marshlands that could support movement, marking them with subtle indicators that Soviet troops understood, but Germans would not notice. They had deliberately weakened areas where German forces were likely to establish positions, removing supporting vegetation or channeling water to create traps beneath seemingly solid surfaces. They had constructed their own defensive positions on the few areas of genuinely stable ground, creating islands of strength in a sea of treacherous terrain. The Soviet Second Shock Army, tasked with the Lyubin offensive, included specialized units equipped and trained for operations in exactly this type of terrain. Soldiers wore white camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the snow-covered landscape. They carried lightweight equipment and avoided heavy concentrations that might break through the surface layer. They moved in small groups, distributing their weight, traveling along routes that Soviet engineers had determined could support foot traffic. When they encountered German positions, they would often simply bypass them, knowing that German troops could not effectively maneuver in the unstable terrain and could be isolated and reduced at leisure. German forces attempting to respond to Soviet penetrations found movement nearly impossible. Roads that had been built on what appeared to be solid ground would break apart under the weight of vehicles, trucks, and half-tracks sinking axle-deep into suddenly liquid mud. Tracked vehicles fared better but still struggled, their tracks chewing through the surface layer into the semi-liquid peat below, where even powerful engines could not generate sufficient traction. Units ordered to move to threatened sectors would require hours to travel distances that should have taken minutes. Their columns strung out along the few passable routes, vulnerable to Soviet artillery and air attack. The cold, rather than improving the situation as German commanders had hoped, often made things worse. Temperatures would drop at night, freezing the surface and creating an appearance of stability. German engineers would work through the night constructing positions, taking advantage of the frozen ground. But daytime temperatures, even in winter, would sometimes rise above freezing, or the heat from German positions and equipment would thaw the surface locally, and the positions built at night would begin sinking by afternoon. This cycle of freezing and thawing created conditions of perpetual instability, where nothing remained solid for long. German soldiers began developing their own adaptations, learning through bitter experience what Soviet troops already knew. They learned to identify the subtle signs of unstable ground, certain types of vegetation, slight depressions in the snow, areas where water had pooled and refrozen. They learned to distribute weight by laying logs or branches before walking or placing equipment. They learned to avoid concentrating forces or supplies in any single location. They learned to construct floating platforms using available timber, creating artificial foundations that distributed weight across larger areas. These adaptations helped, but they were learned slowly, at the cost of equipment lost and soldiers who drowned or froze to death when positions collapsed. The horror of drowning in freezing water beneath what had appeared to be solid ground became a recurring nightmare for German soldiers. Men would fall through the surface, plunging into water barely above freezing, their heavy winter uniforms becoming waterlogged and dragging them down. If they were fortunate, comrades nearby could pull them out before hypothermia set in. If they were alone, or if the collapse occurred at night, they could disappear completely, their bodies sinking into the peat where they might not be found until spring, if they were found at all. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, a squad leader in the 126th Division, wrote home in February 1942. "This place is hell disguised as earth. We stand guard watching not just for Russians but for signs that the ground beneath us is about to give way. 3 men in my squad have been lost, not killed by enemy fire but swallowed by the ground. We heard them calling out in the darkness, but by the time we reached them with ropes and poles, they were gone. We mark their positions, but we cannot dig for bodies because digging only makes the ground more unstable. They will lie here forever in this cursed marsh. I pray I do not join them." Soviet tactics increasingly focused on exploiting German vulnerability to the terrain. Soviet artillery would target areas where Germans had concentrated forces or supplies, not necessarily to destroy them with direct hits, but to crater the ground and break the surface, creating new areas of instability. Soviet infantry would probe German positions, seeking to drive defenders back into the most treacherous areas. Soviet engineers would sometimes deliberately breach ice on frozen water bodies, creating new hazards that German forces would encounter if forced to retreat or maneuver. The psychological strain on German troops became severe. Combat soldiers can typically accept danger they understand: enemy fire, artillery bombardment, aerial attack. These are threats that can be countered with proper tactics, cover, and vigilance. But danger from the ground itself, from what should be stable foundation becoming treacherous without warning, created anxiety that pervaded every moment. Soldiers could not rest even in supposedly secure rear areas, could not trust that the ground they stood on would remain solid. Sleep became difficult, as men feared that closing their eyes might mean drowning when the ground beneath their sleeping position gave way. German medical personnel reported increasing cases of psychological breakdown, soldiers who refused to leave wooden platforms even when ordered to move, men who became hysterically convinced that the entire region was sinking and that they would all eventually be swallowed by the earth. Cases of what would later be recognized as severe anxiety disorders triggered by the unpredictable and inescapable environmental threat. The normal mechanisms soldiers used to cope with danger, taking cover, maintaining vigilance, trusting in training and equipment, were insufficient against a threat that was omnipresent and invisible. The supply situation deteriorated as the ground's instability made logistics nearly impossible. Supply convoys would set out from rear areas with food, ammunition, and medical supplies, only to have vehicles become stuck in suddenly liquid mud, their cargo irretrievable. Airdrops were attempted but presented their own problems. Supplies dropped from aircraft would often penetrate the surface when they landed, sinking into the peat before recovery teams could reach them. German units found themselves short of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, not because these items were unavailable in the theater, but because they could not be moved to forward positions. Through the treacherous terrain, the Soviet offensive continued. Through February and into March 1942, with Soviet forces advancing through the Volkhov marshlands despite German resistance. Soviet casualties were severe. The Red Army accepted enormous losses in this period, and the terrain that hindered German defense also complicated Soviet attack and supply. But Soviet commanders were willing to trade casualties for territorial gain, particularly when those gains threatened the Leningrad siege. German forces, unable to establish stable defensive lines in the shifting terrain, were gradually pushed back. Their positions collapsed by Soviet attack and by the ground's inherent instability. By late March 1942, the situation in the Volkhov sector had evolved into a complex stalemate. Soviet forces had driven deep salients into German positions, but had not achieved the breakthrough that would lift the Leningrad siege. German forces had contained the offensive, but at enormous cost in casualties, equipment, and morale. Both armies found themselves trapped in terrain that neither could fully control, where the ground remained the dominant factor in all operations. The spring thaw, beginning in April, transformed the already nightmarish conditions into something worse. As temperatures rose, the frozen surface that had provided at least some stability melted completely. The region became an expanse of marsh, open water, and semi-solid ground that would not reliably support even individual soldiers, much less vehicles or heavy equipment. Military operations became nearly impossible for both sides. Front lines dissolved into scattered positions on whatever patches of stable ground existed, with vast areas of simply impassable terrain between opposing forces. German forces attempted to withdraw from the most exposed positions, but withdrawal through the swamps proved nearly as costly as remaining in place. Units would set out to pull back to more defensible lines, only to become stranded when routes that had been passable froze became impassable as they thawed. Entire companies would be cut off, surrounded not by Soviet forces but by water and mud that prevented movement in any direction. Supply by air became the only option, but the Luftwaffe lacked sufficient aircraft to supply the scattered pockets of troops requiring support. Soviet forces faced similar challenges. The Second Shock Army, which had driven the offensive into German positions, found itself dangerously overextended with supply lines that threaded through the marshlands along narrow routes that were breaking apart as the ground thawed. Soviet soldiers, like their German counterparts, found themselves fighting not primarily against enemy troops, but against the environment. Entire Soviet divisions were effectively isolated, dependent on air supply or on nighttime boat traffic through the marshlands to maintain even minimal supplies of food and ammunition. The suffering was extraordinary on both sides. Soldiers of both armies were living in conditions that tested human endurance limits. They were cold, wet, hungry, and constantly threatened by terrain that could kill as readily as enemy fire. Disease spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections decimated units already weakened by malnutrition and exposure. Medical care was minimal, as medical supplies could not be adequately transported to forward positions, and wounded soldiers often could not be evacuated through the impassable terrain. The German Second Army Group, responsible for this sector, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw from the Volkhov marshlands to more defensible positions on solid ground. But Hitler's standing orders prohibited voluntary withdrawal, and local commanders feared the consequences of retreating without authorization. German troops remained in positions that were gradually being destroyed not by Soviet action, but by the spring thaw, watching their fortifications sink into the marsh, their supplies run out, and their comrades die from causes that had nothing to do with combat. Soviet High Command similarly pressured their forces to maintain offensive operations, despite the impossible conditions. Stalin viewed any pause in offensive action as defeatism, demanding that Soviet forces continue attacking regardless of casualties or practical difficulties. Soviet commanders and soldiers found themselves trapped between German fire, impassable terrain, and demands from Moscow for results that the conditions made impossible to achieve. The casualties from non-combat causes exceeded combat losses in this period. Men drowned in marshes, died from exposure, succumbed to disease, or simply disappeared into the swamps where their bodies would never be recovered. Both armies were being consumed not primarily by each other, but by the environment in which they were fighting, an environment that neither side could control or escape. By June 1942, as the ground finally began to dry and firm up with the arrival of summer, both sides were exhausted and depleted. The Soviet offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Leningrad remained under siege. German forces had held their positions, but at a cost that severely weakened the 18th Army. The units that had fought in the Volkhov marshlands through the winter and spring of 1942 were shadows of their former strength, filled with traumatized survivors who had endured an experience unlike any other on the Eastern Front. The Second Shock Army, isolated in the marshlands with increasingly tenuous supply lines, faced catastrophe. German forces launched a counteroffensive in June 1942, cutting off the Soviet salients and encircling large portions of the Second Shock Army. The trapped Soviet forces, numbering perhaps 60,000 soldiers, were systematically destroyed over the following weeks. Many died fighting, many died attempting to break out through the marshlands, and thousands died from starvation and exposure trapped in the swamps with no supply and no escape. The commander of the Second Shock Army, General Andrei Vlasov, would be captured and would later defect to the Germans, forming a collaborationist force, a dramatic fall for an officer who had been considered one of the Red Army's most promising commanders. The German experience in the Volkhov marshlands in early 1942 provided brutal education in the realities of fighting in terrain for which the Wehrmacht was completely unprepared. The lessons learned were documented in after-action reports, tactical studies, and the traumatic memories of survivors. German military doctrine would incorporate some of these lessons, though the Wehrmacht would face similar terrain challenges repeatedly throughout the war on the Eastern Front, never fully solving the problem of how to fight effectively in landscapes that seemed to resist occupation. The primary lesson was the absolute importance of terrain analysis and local knowledge. German forces had advanced into the Volkhov region with inadequate understanding of the ground's characteristics, treating it as if it were similar to terrain they had encountered in Western Europe. This fundamental misunderstanding led to tactical and operational decisions that proved catastrophically flawed. By contrast, Soviet forces, particularly units recruited from the region, possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain that provided decisive advantages. German commanders recognized that fighting in unfamiliar terrain without adequate reconnaissance and without local guides was a recipe for disaster. The second lesson concerned engineering and logistics. Standard German field engineering practices were inadequate for unstable ground. German forces began developing specialized techniques, constructing corduroy roads from logs, building floating platforms, using fascines, bundles of sticks, to reinforce soft ground. But these adaptations were learned slowly and at high cost. German logistics personnel recognized that maintaining supply lines through difficult terrain required different approaches and much more engineer support than operations in stable terrain. The Wehrmacht's logistics system, already strained by the vast distances of the Eastern Front, struggled to adapt to these additional challenges. The psychological dimension emerged as a significant concern. German military leadership had traditionally focused on maintaining discipline and morale through leadership, unit cohesion, and ideological motivation. The Volkhov experience demonstrated that environmental stressors, particularly unpredictable danger from terrain itself, could break even well-disciplined troops if sustained long enough. German personnel officers began recommending rotation of units serving in particularly difficult terrain, though the shortage of available forces made such rotation often impossible in practice. For Soviet forces, the Volkhov operations provided validation of defensive tactics that exploited terrain advantages and confirmation that German forces were vulnerable when operating in unfamiliar environments. Soviet military theorists recognized that while the Red Army could not match German tactical proficiency or equipment quality in open terrain, Soviet forces could leverage intimate knowledge of difficult terrain to offset these disadvantages. This understanding would influence Soviet defensive planning throughout the war, with Soviet commanders increasingly seeking to channel German attacks into terrain that favored defense. The foe. Volkhov fighting also demonstrated the brutal calculus of attritional warfare on the Eastern Front. Both sides had accepted losses that would have been considered unsustainable in Western military traditions, tens of thousands of casualties to gain or defend a few kilometers of essentially worthless marshland. Neither side had achieved meaningful strategic objectives proportionate to the blood expended. Yet both German and Soviet high commands had been willing to continue operations despite the costs, prioritizing operational persistence over casualty considerations. This pattern would repeat throughout the war, as both sides demonstrated willingness to accept losses that seemed incomprehensible to Western observers. The immediate tactical legacy of the Volkhov fighting was increased German respect for terrain as a factor in operations and increased Soviet confidence that determined defense in favorable terrain could stop German advances. The longer-term legacy was psychological. For German soldiers who survived the Volkhov marshlands, the experience reinforced growing doubts about the Eastern Front campaign. They had been promised quick victory, had been told that Soviet resistance was crumbling, had believed that superior German tactics and equipment would prevail. Instead, they had spent months in frozen swamps, fighting an enemy they could not defeat in terrain that seemed actively hostile, losing comrades to drowning and exposure as often as to enemy fire. The experience contributed to gradual erosion of German military morale that would accelerate as the war continued. The Volkhov marshlands today are much as they were in 1942. Forested wetlands, beautiful in summer, frozen and forbidding in winter. The ground retains its treacherous character, though few now have reason to traverse it. The area is sparsely populated, the war's devastation and Soviet-era policies having depopulated much of the region. The forests have reclaimed areas that were cleared during the fighting. The marshes have absorbed most physical traces of the battle. But traces remain for those who search. Amateur historians and artifact hunters occasionally venture into the marshlands, finding rusted weapons, corroded helmets, and occasionally human remains, German and Soviet soldiers who disappeared into the swamps in 1942 and were never recovered. The peat preserves these remains remarkably well, and bodies discovered decades later are often identifiable, allowing closure for families who never learned what happened to their relatives. Russian authorities have established war graves for recovered remains, though many thousands remain entombed in the marshlands where they died. The soldiers who survived the Volkhov fighting carried its memory throughout their lives. German veterans rarely spoke of the experience, but when they did, they invariably mentioned the terror of the moving ground, the sensation of earth that should be solid becoming liquid without warning, the horror of watching comrades disappear into swamps. Soviet veterans remembered similar horrors but also remembered the victory, the successful defense against German attack, the contribution their suffering made to Leningrad's eventual survival. The meaning assigned to the trauma differed, but the trauma itself was comparable. The Volkhov fighting occupies a minor place in popular understanding of World War II, overshadowed by larger battles like Stalingrad or Kursk. But for those who fought there, it represented an experience as intense and horrific as any battle of the war. They had fought an enemy that could not be seen or defeated, terrain itself that moved beneath their feet, that swallowed equipment and men, that turned basic military operations into nightmarish struggles for survival. The ground that began to move in January 1942 beneath German defensive positions continued moving throughout the spring, consuming thousands of lives of soldiers from both armies, writing lessons in mud and blood about the limits of military power when confronting landscapes that resist human presence. The German soldiers who panicked when the ground began to move were not cowards. They were rational men confronting something outside their understanding and experience, solid earth behaving like liquid, defying the fundamental assumptions about reality that allow humans to function. Their panic was appropriate response to impossible circumstances, recognition that they had entered an environment where conventional rules did not apply, where survival required new understanding they lacked time to develop. Many did not survive long enough to adapt. Those who did carried the knowledge that Earth itself could be an enemy, that nature could be as deadly as any human opponent, and that some victories were not worth the cost of attempting them in places where the ground itself fought against you. Tentar novamente.